I'm not Chris Herbert as it announces in the program. I'm in fact Anne Forsyth, a Professor of Urban Planning here, and I'm here to welcome you to the GSD. I particularly want to welcome folks from the National Housing Endowment here because they provide crucial funding for this lecture each year. I'd also especially like to welcome members of the Joint Centre for Housing Studies Policy Advisory Board that provides support for the work of the centre. I've been privileged to go to a couple of their meetings over the last year, and they're a great group. They're a true resource. Now, the Joint Centre has a mission to link policy, planning, business, and academia. And it does this through a number of mechanisms, through its research reports, and in particular through its convenings. And this is one of its most important convenings of the year, bringing people together to talk about an important housing issue. And I'd like to say from the perspective of the Harvard Design School, we feel very privileged to be able to welcome all of you here to discuss key issues in housing and health. But with that welcome, I'll hand it over to Chris, who'll actually take us through the rest of the agenda for the night.
Thank you, Anne. First, let me extend my thanks to Anne Forsyth. Among the many roles she plays here at the Graduate School of Design, she is the chair of our Faculty Advisory Committee. And in that role, she brings a great deal of energy and dedication, as she does to all her roles, in helping to build bridges between us and the GSD and the faculty here at Harvard and helping to expand her horizons. So we're very grateful to Anne for her role. So I just want to acknowledge that in public, Anne, for all that you do for us. A little applause is the least we could do for all the work you do. On behalf of the Joint Center, it is my privilege to welcome our distinguished faculty, students, and the broader community to the 15th John T. Dunlop Lecture. John Dunlop was a remarkable man with a long and distinguished career as an academic, a dean, a mediator, a labor secretary, and advisors to presidents over the span of many decades. Among his many accomplishments, Professor Dunlop was also instrumental in helping to sustain the Joint Center through the years. He recognized the importance of Harvard having a center that focuses on the centrality of housing to the economy, to communities and cities, and to the well-being of families and individuals. Among the many ways he helped to sustain the center, perhaps most notably was through the establishment of our Policy Advisory Board in 1971. And so like Anne, in that regard, I'd like to take this opportunity to have a special welcome to our Policy Advisory Board members who are meeting here in Cambridge today and tomorrow. It's a great pleasure to bring you here to the Graduate School of Design after having spent the afternoon meeting at the Kennedy School. The trip that we made today between the two schools is a reminder of the tremendous value of the exchange of information and ideas between the worlds of policy and design. Essentially, that's the joint in the Joint Center. Professor Dunlop recognized that this kind of cross-disciplinary exchange was essential to addressing the country's housing needs. He also saw that we would need input and energy from the world of business, the public sector, and the nonprofit community. This appreciation of the value of cross-disciplinary and cross-sector perspectives is one of John's enduring legacies for the center. This lecture is another of John's enduring legacies, serving to raise awareness and foster understanding of critical housing issues. So we're pleased to see such a great group gathered here tonight. We're also honored to have as a partner in this lecture the National Housing Endowment, who has been funding this lecture since 1999, a 15-year partnership that we're quite proud of. So with that, I have the privilege of introducing to you Ted Mahoney, trustee of the National Housing Endowment, who'll tell you more about their endowment and their support for this lecture.
Thank you for the kind introduction, Chris. Good evening. My name is Ted Mahoney. I own Windjammer Custom Homes. I'm a local Boston area home builder, and I have the privilege to serve as a trustee at the National Housing Endowment. And of course, I'm here tonight representing the endowment. At NHE, we're very proud of its achievement and its ability to give back to the housing industry. It is now my pleasure to welcome all of our distinguished guests and fellow housing professionals to the 15th Annual Housing Endowment John T. Dunlop Lecture. We are proud to partner with Harvard University and the Joint Center for Housing to host this event. This endowment has long relationships with higher education, funding lectures, doctoral research, joint conferences, seminars, curriculum development, as well as support of the State of the Nation's Housing Report, and of course this lecture. This lecture honors one of the best, John Dunlop, a founding member of the Housing Endowment, the Joint Center of Housing Studies, and the National Housing Endowment. The National Housing Endowment organizes this annual lecture series on housing as a way to recognize and honor John's lifetime commitment to the housing industry. He's greatly missed by all of us. I would like to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit more about the National Housing Endowment. We are the philanthropic arm of the National Association of Home Builders. To date, we've been fortunate that the endowment has raised over $24 million from leaders all across the sector of residential housing industry. These gifts have been made with one purpose, to invest in the future of the housing industry. In turn, the endowment has awarded over $12.4 million in scholarships and grants to advance the areas of education, research, and training in the housing industry. Our current focus is on the Home Building Education Leadership Program, known as HELP, which provides grants to colleges and universities to create or expand the number of qualified housing management professionals entering our industry. Before we begin, it's my privilege to recognize two people. First, Isaac Heimbinder. Isaac. He is a trustee, a fellow trustee of the National Housing Endowment, who has helped the endowment fund this lecture for the past 4 years. We really appreciate everything you've done for us. And Bernie Gilberman. Bernie, would you stand, please? Bernie's been a policy advisory member since 2011 and helped the National Housing Endowment sponsor the State of the Nation's Housing Report. Thank you both for your help and generosity. We greatly appreciate it, the endowment. With no further ado, and on behalf of the trustees of the National Housing Endowment, I welcome all of you here this evening to the 15th Annual Housing Endowment John T. Dunlop Lecture. At this time, I'd like to have Chris come back and introduce our guest speaker tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Ted. So finally, without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Jonathan Rose to deliver this year's lecture. In many respects, it's harder to imagine a more fitting person to deliver this lecture. As I noted earlier, Professor Dunlop saw tremendous value in drawing upon a range of academic disciplines and engaging the energy of the business, the public, and the not-for-profit sectors in addressing pressing housing and community development challenges. In his work, Jonathan embodies this melding of discipline and approaches. As a leader in the smart growth, green building, affordable housing, and national infrastructure movements, he acts in the roles of developer, project manager, planner, investor, and policy advocate. And sometimes he has time to travel here as well after doing all these roles. He pursues solutions in these critically important areas through for-profit business, not-for-profit entities, and as a thought leader, all with the aim of creating a more environmentally, socially, and economically resilient world. In 1989, he founded Jonathan Rose Companies, LLC, a multidisciplinary real estate development, planning, and investment firm, which has successfully completed more than $1.5 billion of work. In 2005, the firm launched the nation's first green transit-oriented acquisition and development fund, followed by green affordable housing and office transformation funds. The firm's innovative work has won awards from a wide range of notable organizations, including the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the National Resources Defense Council, the Global Green USA, the Urban Land Institute, the American Planning Association, and the American Institute of Architects. He is Vice Chair of Enterprise Community Partners, serves as a trustee of the National Resources Defense Council, and serves on the board of the Brooklyn Academy of Music. He chaired the Metropolitan Transit Authority's Blue Ribbon Sustainability Commission, which developed the nation's first green transit plan, and was a commissioner of the Governor Cuomo's NYS 2100 Commission, tasked with identifying strategies for the long-term resilience of New York's infrastructure post-Hurricane Sandy. Jonathan's company's stated mission is ambitious as it is succinct: to repair the fabric of communities. Working to provide housing that's affordable, of high quality, and green is certainly central to that mission. but it also requires working with cities, not-for-profits to build civic, cultural, educational, and open space infrastructure. As this lecture tonight will illuminate, these efforts go well beyond simply enhancing the built environment toward the goal of building community. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Rose to deliver his lecture, The Entwinement of Housing, Neighborhood, and Weebly.
Thank you. Very, very nice. Thank you. Distinguished faculty and staff, Policy Advisory Board members, the National Housing Endowment members who are here tonight, and friends, thank you for coming. It is an honor to have been invited to give the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard University's 2014 Dunlop lecture, and to join the company of so many distinguished past lecturers. Professor Dunlop was born in Placerville, California, and spent his early years living on a family pear ranch. When he was 4, his parents, who were Presbyterian missionaries, moved the family to the island of Cebu, which is the densest island in the Philippines. And Dunlop lived there until he graduated from high school, and then he went to University of California at Berkeley, and ultimately graduated with highest honors with a degree in economics. In 1937, he received a fellowship to study economics at Cambridge with John Maynard Keynes. It turns out he wasn't really able to study that much with Keynes, but he and his wife Dorothy shared a small house with John Kenneth Galbraith and his wife Kitty, and they became really close friends. They came back to Harvard together, and for the next 60 years, Dunlop and Galbraith were close friends and colleagues with offices just 2 doors apart for 60 years. Dunlop advised every president from Franklin Roosevelt to Bill Clinton, balancing an extraordinary career as a cabinet officer, a writer, a thinker, and a teacher. But he was best known as a mediator, settling a significant national labor disputes, such as an 8-year battle between Campbell Soup Company and the Farm Labor Organizing Committee regarding the conditions of migrant workers who supplied Campbell with tomatoes. And at Harvard in 1971, between 1969 and 1971, which is a very volatile period for those of us who were around those days, he mediated the peace between the rancorous students, faculty, and administration. In 1973, went back to Washington, and he replaced Donald Rumsfeld as the director of the Cost of Living Council. And I wish that he could have replaced Rumsfeld as the Secretary of Defense. Along the way, in 1971, Dunlop also formed the Joint Center's Policy Advisory Board, a distinguished group of advisors whose roles helped the Joint Center identify emerging housing issues and trends, and they've been meeting here today. The Joint Center's work has been essential to shaping our nation's housing policy. Amongst its extensive work, its annual State of the Nation's Housing Report is a must-read for those who are interested in housing issues. Sadly, its 2014 report notes that more than a third of American households and more than 50% of Americans' renters pay more than a third of their income towards housing. And in high-cost communities, even middle-income families cannot find affordable housing. For example, in Los Angeles and Orange counties, which was once a mecca of middle-class housing, today fewer than 25% of the homes on the market are affordable to middle-class buyers. Housing is the platform from which family success grows, and is typically a family's largest cost. Over 80% of poor families pay more than a third of their income on housing, and 69% pay more than half. If you add the cost of food, transportation, utilities, phone, internet, clothing, education, and health, I just don't understand how a family can make that all work. That's why so many poor families end up doubled up and tripled up, living in overcrowded conditions, or always on the move, living where they can. Working and lower middle class families trying to balance 2 part-time jobs with unreliable hours also often live in overcrowded housing because they need the free childcare that is provided by the presence of other adults when they are out working. So housing comes with a second cost also, which is transportation. Poverty is increasingly a suburban phenomenon. Over 50% of America's poor families today live in the suburbs. And the global poor often live in informal slums, sprawling out from the edge of cities. Suburban poor families working in America often spend 20 to 30% of their income on auto-based transportation. To add to this burden, they often live in very poorly insulated, energy inefficient homes that add huge utility costs. And those lower income families that are able to find a stable place to live from paycheck to paycheck. One missed paycheck or family emergency sets off a cascade of missed payments and difficult choices. If a parent misses one day to take a sick child to a clinic, they may be fired or demoted or their work hours cut. This can put them over the financial edge and make them unable to pay their rent. This vulnerability affects a much larger percentage of America than just its poorest. In a 2011 study by the National Council for Credit Counseling, found that 64% of Americans have less than $1,000 of savings to deal with an emergency, and 30% had no savings whatsoever other than retirement funds. Savings are a critical element of a family's economic resilience. This sense of living on the edge undermines their overall sense of well-being. The stress of just getting by is enormous. Furthermore, affordable unsubsidized housing is often older and very poor condition and is being abandoned and demolished at a great rate. According to the Joint Center's 2011 report, more than 29% of the housing stock that was rented to low-income families between 1999 and 2009 was torn down or abandoned. So, low-income families and moderate-income families, the challenge of finding and keeping safe, secure, and a well-located place to live is very stressful. But low-income communities are also rife with other stresses, such as crime and neighborhood violence, low wage, low opportunity work, the lack of access to health care, poor food, poor schools. These endemic stresses never go away. They are always there. The residents of these neighborhoods not only have fewer financial reserves, but it turns out that they also have fewer cognitive reserves. And although these communities are characterized by their relative isolation, they're subject to the same global trends that affect every community on Earth, things such as climate change, globalization, growing income inequality, financial volatility, epidemics, migrations of climate refugees, and others. These macro trends are characterized by their volatility, adding volatile episodic stresses to the endemic one. When episodic stresses such as Hurricane Katrina, Superstorm Sandy, the fires in California, the floods in Colorado, the tornadoes in Missouri, or the waves of foreclosure that are striking communities that are already saturated with endemic stresses, the community's residents and the social service systems that support them lack the resilience to respond. Children's Health Watch notes that a safe, stable home is important for children's physical and mental health today and for their growth and learning abilities tomorrow. I suspect that everybody who follows the work of the Joint Center has long believed this, but over the last 20 years, advances in cognitive science have deepened our understanding of the development of the mind and the critical relationship between cognitive health and the health of the individual, the family, and the community. And we now more deeply understand the importance of a safe, stable home as a secure base. In 1988, British psychologist John Bowlby published Secure Base, in which he described the importance of a secure psychological base in the development of healthy children. Bowlby described it as a secure base from which a child or adolescent can make sorties into the outside world, and to which he can return knowing that he'll be welcomed when he gets there, nourished physically, emotionally, comforted if distressed, and reassured if frightened. The premise of this lecture is that there is a deep interdependence between the cognitive security of individuals, their families, and their environment, and their physical and mental health, and that these factors deeply affect their capacity to function in the world. There are many contributors to a lack of security or sense of security, but it is very clear that the endemic stresses of living in low-income communities corrode a developing child's sense of security. Add to this the episodic stresses of the large-scale events that are out of control of any individual or community, and the cognitive security needed to grow healthy children becomes frayed. These cognitive stresses have lasting negative impacts on the child's physical and mental health for the rest of their lives, and these impacts ripple through communities. A few years ago, a leader of a not-for-profit low-income housing development company desperate to increase their supply of affordable housing in his community, said at an Enterprise Rose Fellowship meeting, "My community suffers from a terrible overcrowding. We often have 13 extended family members living in a single home. And one evening, invariably, a drunk uncle comes home and rapes a young girl, and everybody in the house knows it, and everybody feels complicit, and everybody is damaged. If I can just move every single mother and her children into their own safe, green apartments, then we can help them move forward with their lives." The rape of a child is a terrible thing. The medical community labels it an adverse childhood experience, or an ACE. ACEs are significant negative childhood experiences that deeply affect the child's development. They fall into 3 categories: abuse, neglect, and household dysfunction. They include emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, excessive noise at home, sudden eviction, observing a parent subjected to violence, property victimization, peer victimization, exposure to community violence, socioeconomic status, parents always arguing, household substance abuse, mental illness, parental separation or divorce, and a parent who is sent to prison. The effect of these adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, on the health and life outcomes of victims are significant. In 1993, Dr. Robert Anda, an epidemiologist at the Center for Disease Control, and Dr. Vincent Folletti, who is an internist at the Kaiser Permanente branch in San Diego, began a decade-long study of more than 17,000 people in the Kaiser system to better understand the impact of ACEs. Approximately 75% of the population that they studied was white and had a college degree, and yet 12.6% of them had an ACEs score of 4 or more. So each point on an ACEs score is 1 event. So they experienced 4 or more events before they're 3 years old. Adults who experienced 4 or more ACEs as a child were twice as likely to be smokers, 12 times as likely to attempt suicide, 7 times as likely to be an alcoholic, and 10 times more likely to inject street drugs. A child with 4 or more ACEs is 4 times more likely to have intercourse by the age of 15, and 40% of the girls with 4 or more ACEs become pregnant as teenagers. There's a deep connection between a child's ACEs score and their health. As an adult, those who have experienced 4 or more ACEs are 260% more likely to have chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and somebody with an ACEs score than somebody who has a score of 0. They're 240 more times likely to have hepatitis, 250 times percent more likely to contract sexually transmitted disease, and if they experience, so ACEs is cumulative, it's in direct relationship to frequency. 6 or more ACEs increases one's chance of getting lung cancer by 300%, and if one gets it, one's likely to live 13 years less. And by the way, since this initial study was done, it's been repeated in many communities on many large databases, and it's been confirmed over and over again. These adverse childhood experiences are prevalent all over the world, but they are particularly prevalent in low-income communities. Adverse childhood experiences are what Dr. Jack Shonkoff, who's the director of Harvard Center on the Developing Child, labels toxic stress. Not all stress, by the way, is toxic stress. Some stress is actually positive and advances cognitive development. For example, if a child experiences moderate stress, such as having to read a poem to a whole school assembly, and they live in a supportive environment with protective adults, this positive stress actually develops coping skills and makes the child more resilient. There's also tolerable stress, such as the death of a grandparent, somebody deeply loved, which can be very hard on a child, but with support, the child's mind recovers. But toxic stress is so frequent or so intense that it permanently affects the body and the mind's stress responses. When a human encounters a threat, the brain sends a message to the hypothalamus, part of the brain that regulates the body's autonomic and homeostatic systems. The hypothalamus compares the threat with memories in the hippocampus, and if the memories are bad, it releases hormones to trigger pituitary gland to instruct the adrenal glands to release 2 hormones, cortisol and adrenal. This neural network is called the HPA axis. Imagine you're walking through the woods and you come across a bear. The HPA axis releases adrenaline, which prepares you to fight or flight, and it speeds up your heart, contracts your pupils, focuses your attention. If you have to run for a long time, then your pituitary gland releases cortisol, which increases your blood pressure and your blood sugar, turns down the immune response, and that enhances your long-term running ability. Under normal circumstances, after these stress pass, the HPA axis relaxes and returns to normal balance. But if the stress is continuous, the HPA pathway is jarred open, and it remains permanently on, even when it's not needed. Its neural patterns become fixed. They become grooves. Children who encounter adverse childhood experiences have their HPA axes wired permanently on. They develop smaller prefrontal cortexes, producing less robust control connections between it and the amygdala, and this circuit is key for self-regulation, particularly the ability of people to regulate their reactions to perceived threats. And thus, children who suffer from continuous toxic stress or frequent ACEs are more likely to be recessive, withdrawn, less able to pay attention in school, and to participate in activities or make friends. In effect, until puberty, they are permanently in the flight mode. And then after puberty, they shift permanently into the fight mode. The overactive HPA axis condition is expressed as continuous anger and anxiety. Combined with an inability to pay attention and self-regulate, they lack the key functions needed to perform well in school. It leads boys to drop out, join gangs, engage in crime, girls to become pregnant, etc. And then these women, as resentful, stressed out, poor mothers, pass on this condition to their children. And this condition is inheritable. There's now ample evidence to show that toxic stress on young rats produces epigenetic changes that continue across generations. And one of the key genes we've seen that has changed in rats that is identified with the passing on of toxic stress is the NR3C1 gene. Recent research has translated these rat studies into humans. Seth Pollack at the University of Wisconsin's Weizmann Center's Child Emotion Research Lab recruited 50 children with a history of abuse to study their genes and discovered that their NR3C1 genes had been methylated in the very same sites that were methylated in the highly stressed rats. The center also measured the size of the children's amygdalas and hippocampuses and observed that the children who experienced poverty, neglect, or physical abuse had smaller ones. And research by Bruce McEwen at Rockefeller University and his colleagues showed that parental care affects epigenetic regulation of the hippocampal-glucocortical receptor expression and impacts suicide rates. And Teresa Brockie has studied ACEs in Native American communities and has found similar epigenetic effects. So this is early work, but it's very actually troubling. Overcrowding, excessive noise, and transience also affect young children. Studies by Gary Evans, a research scientist at Cornell University's Department of Human Development, Design, and Environmental Analysis, indicate that overcrowding itself produces a negative health effect on children's interpersonal behaviors, mental health, motivation, cognitive development, and biological measures. And in this case, overcrowding is not a function of family size or even family income. Rather, it is simply caused by the density or number of people per room. Parents in overcrowded homes are also less responsive to young children, perhaps due to their own ACEs. Evans's research shows that parents who raise children in crowded homes also speak less frequently to their children and use less complicated words. And a study by Betty Hart and Todd Risley at Rice University shows that that too has a negative impact. After 4 years, children on welfare have heard 30 million fewer words than children from high-income families. And yet the low-income children, even though they've heard 30 million fewer words, will have heard 125,000 more words of discouragement and 560 fewer words of praise. This too has a cognitive effect. So parents who raise children in overcrowded homes are more likely to engage in punitive parenting and significantly increasing the child's level of distress. And again, this also is correlated with chaos and disorder in a home and not with income. And then housing evictions, something I referred to much earlier, are also a driver of ACEs, and the financial crisis has not helped. In Milwaukee County, between 2010 and 2013, the number of eviction cases has increased by 43%. In Maine, it's increased by 21%, and in Massachusetts, during the same period, 11%. Matthew Desmond, a Harvard sociologist who studied evictions in Milwaukee, said, "You would think that evictions are caused by job loss, but we found that evictions can actually cause you to lose your job. And once evicted, people have higher rates of depression, material hardness, hunger, and lack of medical care." And then there's the issue of vicarious trauma. In 2003, Diana Rose, the founding president of the Garrison Institute, began a program to address the endemic stresses that New York City area domestic violence shelter social workers are subject to, and the effect of those stresses on the social workers' effectiveness and well-being. She and noted meditation teacher Sharon Salzberg founded the Contemplative-Based Resilience Program to understand and relieve these stresses that the social workers in the system were experiencing. They began with the work of Lorianne Perlman, who was then president of the Trauma Research, Education, and Training Institute. And they've extensively studied the issue of vicarious trauma or trauma transference. Vicarious or transferred trauma occurs when the trauma passes from the traumatized population to its caregivers. This is a little-known phenomena and is one of the major causes of burnout, stress, depression, and even suicide in the social service and medical communities who do their work to altruistically serve particularly low-income and troubled communities. So if we're going to address the effects of the epidemic of ACEs and toxic stress, then with any epidemic, we also have to protect the service professionals who come in contact with the epidemic, because it too is transferred. The Contemplative-Based Resilience Project uses a four-pronged approach to mediating vicarious trauma: yoga, because trauma is embodied; meditation to detoxify the mind; psychosocial education; and community building. And the Garrison team has gone on to apply this work with humanitarian aid workers around the world. We'll see about that work in America too. So Dr. Nadine Burke Harris is a pediatrician who joined the California Pacific Medical Center in 2007. And the medical center is a private healthcare network, and she opened a clinic in the Bayview 100 Point neighborhood. This is one of the poorest neighborhoods in San Francisco, and is centered on a very old and very poor shape public housing project. That project is part of a larger program called Hope SF. Hope SF is San Francisco's program to revitalize its public housing. And this happens to be a community with enormous health disparities. Hope SF noticed that the level of violence in Hunter's View at that time was 10 times that as San Francisco as a whole. And 73% of the able-bodied adults were unemployed, and 53% of the project's students were chronically absent from school. But what really surprised Dr. Burke Harris was the degree of health issues that her patients had, and she set out to discover why. And once she learned about ACEs and toxic stress, and figured out that they were most likely the cause of the health epidemic in the Bayview Hunters Point community, she set out to find a cure. Dr. Burke Harris's project, now called the Center for Youth Wellness, has developed a multidisciplinary approach, focusing on identifying, preventing, and undoing the chemical, psychological, neurodevelopmental consequences of ACEs. The Center for Youth Wellness uses a multi-pronged approach, working with both affected children and their parents. Its work begins with an assessment done in the clinic, the home, and the school. What she found is you never really know just from a clinical assessment what's really going on to determine the child's exposure to adversity and the depth of its effects on the child's well-being. The center educates families on the causes and symptoms of chronic stress and provides families with stress-reducing solutions. Children and their families are also provided with psychotherapeutic treatments by the UCSF's Child Trauma Research Program and the Early Life Stress and Pediatric Anxiety Program at the Lucille Packard Children's Hospital. The Center for Youth Wellness also trains patients in mindfulness and coping skills, which help patients and their families build the cognitive resilience to manage future stressful events. And Hope SF has initiated a program of trauma-informed building management, integrating trauma awareness and solutions into all of its public housing work. This begins by recognizing the deleterious effect of trauma on both residents and staff, and then figuring out how to integrate solutions at every level of the system, addressing endemic and vicarious trauma at the individual and project level. So what we've learned from this is just as the world needs a healthy ecology to thrive, a healthy natural ecology to thrive, it also needs a healthy cognitive ecology, or mental landscape of thinking, feeling, and relating. If we're going to ease endemic poverty, we need to recognize that it persists in an invisible, pervasive cognitive ecology of toxic stress that deeply permeates not only families living in low-income communities, but also the caregivers who are trying to support them. We should also note that although toxic stress is both concentrated and exacerbated in low-income communities, it is increasingly prevalent through all segments of society. This cognitive ecology is the soil of civilization. The work of those of us involved in community development must include the creation of positive cognitive ecologies so that both human and natural systems will thrive. So environmental toxins have also been shown to negatively impact neural development and measurably degrade the intelligence of children, especially if their mothers are exposed during pregnancy. Outdoor air pollution generated by the burning of fossil fuels pollutes air with polycyclical aromatic hydrocarbons, methyl mercury, sulfur, nitrogen oxides, and other toxins. Indoor toxic exposures include lead, mold, pests, pesticides, and excessive dust. All of these toxins may be present in any home, but they are particularly concentrated in low-income homes and neighborhoods. For example, low-income families often, if the landlord doesn't turn the heat on, will heat their home by turning on a gas oven and opening the oven, which then puts toxins into the air. Dr. Frederica Pereira at the Mailman School of Public Health notes that the direct toxic effects of exposure to these chemicals includes increased infant mortality, lower birth weights, deficits in lung functioning, increased childhood asthma, development disorders, and to me very disturbing also, intellectual disabilities, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and an increased risk of childhood cancers. So we have a cognitive and environmental toxic soup. The combined cognitive effects of toxic stress and toxic chemicals cannot be good. If a child's immune response is rendered less effective by cognitive stress, then they are likely to be more vulnerable to the neurotoxins and other stresses. This toxic soup is also pervasive, but invisible, and it's critical that we identify its components and its compounding effects. Although the work on toxic stress is in its early years, 4 strategies to relieve it have emerged. The first takes us back to housing, a safe place that is physically, psychologically, and environmentally safe, non-chaotic, and nurturing. It is becoming increasingly clear that such housing is the ground of physical and mental health. Dr. Megan Sandell says that housing is a vaccine for these diseases. And safe, green, calming, socially altruistic housing community is not only an essential platform for the restoration and resilience of chronically stressed families, but also for the social and healthcare workers who serve them because they also live in this housing. The housing stress documented by the Joint Center's 2014 report applies to many of America's service workers. The 2013 median salary of a home health aide was $20,000, 12% lower than the poverty level. Hospital orderlies earn a median salary of $23,000. The average domestic violence shelter worker in 2013 earned $37,000 a year. These families, too, are housing stressed. We're rapidly accumulating evidence that greener, healthier housing provides a significant public health benefit at very little additional cost. At this point, there's simply no reason to justify the construction of another toxic housing unit. So housing is solution number 1. The second strategy is exercise. Bruce McEwen's work at Rockefeller has demonstrated that exercise stimulates healthy neurogenesis, and we know exercise is deeply connected to a community's walkability. A study published in the Journal of Preventative Health found that children who live in smart growth neighborhoods get significantly more exercise than those who live in suburban environments designed for driving. As the percentage of poor families living in the suburbs continues to increase, less exercise and social isolation becomes a more significant issue. And walkability is an urban issue too. A study by the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene discovered that the walkability of New York City's neighborhoods varies significantly. Walkability they defined as a mix of residential density, intersection density, land use, subway stop density, and the ratio of retail building area to retail land area. The study concluded that people living in the most walkable neighborhoods walked 100 more minutes a week than those living in the least walkable neighborhoods. And this amount of exercise was significant enough to impact obesity rates. The third strategy is the development of mental quiet and space. Dr. Richie Davidson, the founder of the Center of the Study of Healthy Minds, also at the University of Wisconsin's Weizmann Center, and he, by the way, is a Harvard graduate, has extensively studied the efficacy of mindfulness training on stress and has documented the positive neurological and immunological benefits that come from it. His lab has also published research indicating a range of contemplative practices that can increase a child's self-regulation, attention, and social and pro-social behaviors such as compassion and empathy. And the Garrison Institute's contemplative-based resilience program has demonstrated the efficacy of meditation in alleviating vicarious trauma. Dr. Burke Harris told me that once she began attending the meditation classes that were intended for her patients, she was just sitting in to see what they were doing. She discovered that the peacefulness that it engendered increased her own resilience, and so she made it a critical part of her own practice. Both McEwen and Davidson's work shows that contemplative practices such as meditation can stimulate the regrowth of healthy brain structures in as little as 8 weeks. And the work of Dr. Tanya Singer, the managing director of social neuroscience at the Max Planck Institute for Human Cognitive Brain Science in Austria, shows that contemplative practices increase empathy and pro-social behavior. And empathy and altruism are essential elements of healthy communities. The fourth solution is the benefit that comes from being part of a community that models a thriving, supportive, healthy human connection. Eric Kleinenberg's study of the response of Chicago neighborhoods to the stresses of heat waves indicates the importance of social networks in individual and cognitive resilience. In 1997, Chicago was struck by a deadly heat wave. Most of the people who died were poor and elderly. They often didn't have air conditioning, or if they did, they couldn't afford to turn it on. They're afraid to open their windows or doors at night because they're afraid of intruders. Of the 10 communities with the highest death rates from the heat wave, 8 were predominantly African American, with high rates of crime and unemployment. But oddly, 3 of the 10 communities with the lowest death rates were also African American and poor, and had very high rates of unemployment and crime. For example, the Auburn-Gresham neighborhood, which is a poor neighborhood, had a strong culture of altruism, caring for others, carried out through networks of churches and voluntary associations. The death rate in Auburn-Gresham was only 3 per 100,000, one of the lowest rates in the city, and lower than the death rates in many prosperous white neighborhoods. Kleinenberg concluded that the difference in the rates of death correlated with the strength or weakness of the social networks of the community. So these 4 strategies, stable housing, exercise, meditation and other ways of developing cognitive resilience, and strong social networks, these 4 strategies provide the psychosocial base upon which one can most transform trauma into resilience. Building enough safe, green, walkable, sociable, affordable housing is the first step, but is only the first step. Social scientist Robert Sampson, who's now at Harvard, spent 12 years at the University of Chicago, where he organized the Project on Human Development in Chicago Neighborhoods to compare social performance of the city's neighborhoods and determine what were the key drivers of the social health of these neighborhoods and their impact on children and adolescents. Sampson studied a wide range of neighborhoods with a wide range of incomes and measures of violence, and also tracked 6,000 randomly selected children and adolescents and young adults and studied them over 7 years. The data clearly indicated that civic behavior was spatially clustered with enormous variability, and it related to the performance of the neighborhoods. Sampson's works observed that neighborhoods that had the best school performance and the best health also had the best health The neighborhoods with the best school performances had the best health outcomes and the lowest crime levels and the lowest proportion of teen pregnancies, and that these outcomes were all interrelated and they were persistent over time. The neighborhoods with the best outcomes remained them over time, even though people moved in and out of them. And so Sampson concluded that neighborhoods themselves have enduring characteristics that both attract and shape the behavior of residents. In his book, The Great American City, Chicago and the Enduring Neighborhood Effect, Sampson wrote, "Neighborhoods are important determinants of the quality and quantity of human behavior in their own right." Sampson determined that the two most important factors that affect the quality of neighborhoods are the conditions and perception of disorder in the neighborhood and something he called collective efficacy, the social cohesion that combines the shared expectations for social control. These two conditions are deeply interrelated and they correlate with toxic stress. So disorder and collective efficacy. The perception of neighborhood disorder has two forms, social disorder and physical disorder. Physical disorder is graffiti, abandoned, poorly kept buildings, uncollected garbage, broken windows. In social disorder, we often see as openly solicited prostitution, drug dealing, public intoxication, verbal harassment, loud music, rowdiness, etc. Sampson's study correlated the variations in community social norms with the orderliness of the neighborhoods. So what he discovered was the more disorderly neighborhoods had a lower sense of well-being. It's pretty obvious, and more orderly neighborhoods had a higher sense of well-being. In 1965, in a speech that Jim Rouse gave in Chicago, he said, "We believe, because it is true, that people are affected by their environment, by space and scale, by color and texture, by nature and beauty, and that they can be uplifted, made comfortable, made important." Sampson posited that when neighborhoods share expectations of social control in their neighborhood, when they trust each other, when they feel social cohesion, their neighbors generate much better outcomes. Neighborhoods with high levels of collective efficacy have lower levels of crime, lower rates of teen pregnancy, infant mortality, etc. This holds true whether the neighborhood is black or white, rich or poor. Through dense personal ties, the contagion of positive behavior helps facilitate collective efficacy. Neighborhoods with the highest levels of social control have people who watch out for other kids, scold teenagers for loud behavior, and they watch out for each other. Reflecting on this, Alejandro Portes, who's a sociologist at Princeton University, recommended that we expand the definition of social capital to include not only social connections and its attendant norms and trust, which is the normal definition, but also to say that social capital is made of expectations for action within collectivity. That is, that social connections and trust will produce outcomes for the common good, the belief in that. And Sampson also found that collective efficacy strongly correlated with altruism. Neighborhoods with higher levels of altruistic behaviors also had better health, well-being, and safety measures. It turns out that efficacy or agency reduces stress, and so the fourth solution, vibrant social networks, help not only mediate toxic stress in children and social workers, but it creates the ground of healing communities. Collective efficacy is the emergent behavior of a complex adaptive system, the neighborhood. It is increased by the success of community organizations such as PTAs, neighborhood watches, tenant associations, community gardens, etc. And by mapping the locations of the city's not-for-profit organizations, Sampson discovered that their density was one of the strongest predictors of collective efficacy. When Sampson looked at the neighborhood's data, and we plotted it all on a map of Chicago, an interesting phenomenon emerged. Just as people have 3 degrees of influence upon each other, neighborhoods also seem to have 3 degrees of influence upon each other too. If the crime rate is high in one neighborhood, it's positively linked to crime in an adjacent neighborhood. If the homicide rate in a neighborhood goes up by 40%, its neighbors will experience a direct 9% increase in homicide, and their neighbors a 3% increase. On the other hand, if the indicators of collective efficacy go up in a neighborhood by 1 standard deviation, the homicide rates in adjoining neighborhoods go down by 15%. This means that every neighborhood of a city benefits from improving the health, safety, and well-being of the city's worst neighborhoods, and every family in a city benefits from the alleviation of a toxic stress of every child, no matter how far removed from them. And thus, altruism generates a benefit, a collective benefit for the entire city. The Center for Disease Control, in a study in 2000, based on 2008 data, estimated that the total lifetime financial cost of just 1 year of confirmed cases of child abuse or sexual abuse, psychological abuse, ranged from $124 billion to as high as $585 billion. That's one age, one year through their whole life. So if we think of a whole generation, it's 20 times that number. We're in the trillions. The costs were arrived at by summing the short-term healthcare costs, long-term medical costs, child welfare costs, special education costs, criminal justice costs, productivity losses. And this does not take into account the cognitive effects of toxic stress that pass from generation to generation. And thus, if we can invest in preventing and healing this issue now, the long-term benefits to individuals and society will be enormous. The cost of environmental toxins are equally large. A literature review by Dr. Pereira found in the 2008 costs of environmentally mediated diseases in U.S. children, including lead poisoning, prenatal methylmercury exposure, childhood cancer, asthma, intellectual disability, autism, were $76.6 billion, again, per age cohort. We know enough to know these constitute an epidemic. The system for combating a single vector disease, such as a flu, requires the systemic integration of many public and private sectors, from scientists, public health officials, pharmaceutical manufacturers, distributors, inoculators, etc. Imagine how much more complex the fight against a multi-vector disease, such as toxic stress, is. This requires that we think about community development in an entirely different way. We need to recognize that safe, green, well-located housing for populations suffering from toxic and environmental stresses are necessary, but not sufficient. We need to invest far more capital and social service funds now in the alleviation of ACEs, toxic stress, and vicarious trauma to preempt the unsustainable human, social, and economic costs that are coming later. To achieve this, we need a massive social impact bond funding program to bring forward future savings. It must be accompanied by trauma-aware health and social services that must aggressively work to sever the roots of these endemic illnesses. The solutions that we invest in must address cognitive stress, financial stress, environmental and climate stress in an integrated way, tying together solutions at the individual level to increase individual, building, neighborhood, and city scale resilience. Quantum physics began with a study of the particle, but it very quickly observed that particles were actually interrelated, that the condition of one particle affects the condition of others. Quantum theory posits that each particle alone is in a pure state, but in actuality, the condition of each individual particle is what they call entangled, or woven together with every other particle. This is called quantum entanglement. In the early 1800s, psychologists also posited that each person had an individual mind with goals, wants, needs, and predispositions which set our behaviors, and that these were all individual. But we have also learned that we're deeply social animals, that our behaviors are entangled with those of others, that our states of mind and qualities of behavior are heavily determined by the collective state of the group and the context that we're part of. Cities are systems. They're interwoven systems. Every aspect of a city is interconnected through a marvelous web of interdependence. As Dr. Martin Luther King said in his letter from a Birmingham jail, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied together in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Entanglement is a physical condition of interdependence, but it lacks moral direction. King's letter from a Birmingham jail beseeches his readers to become moral activists and to do so with love. If a city adopts altruistic goals, the DNA of altruistic intentions will flow through the city's systems, ultimately touching every part of the city. When altruism weaves into the fabric of a city, it creates an energized and altruistic culture. It adds a moral direction to the amoral interdependence of nature's entanglement. And I call this altruistically directed interdependence, entwinement. Housing is a necessary ground of a stable base with which well-being grows, but housing alone is insufficient to transform the lives of families living with toxic stress, insecurity, high levels of neighborhood disorder, and low levels of collective efficacy. We're just at the beginning of understanding the interconnection of well-being of children, their families, their housing, their neighborhoods, and the cities that they live in, but we do know that they're all entwined, and that every step we take to relieve the toxic causes and conditions of economic, psychological, and spiritual poverty for one child improve the well-being for all of us. And as we infuse our entwined human system with pervasive altruism, informed by science, carried out with compassion, and dedicated to the well-being of all, that is the ground upon which the relief of endemic poverty will grow. Thank you. Sure.
Thank you, Jonathan. We are getting close to our hour, but I think we'd be remiss if we didn't take this opportunity to ask Jonathan a few questions. So I don't know if there are microphones over here. Question?
Hello. First, I want to thank you. Hey, hi. My name is Jared. I'm an urban planner here and an MBA student at HBS. First, I want to thank you so much for coming here today. It was a really interesting speech. And I think your point is very well taken. You know, since Rees and Engels have been documenting the condition of poor housing, you know, in the 19th century, poor social conditions stemming from poor housing conditions has been very well known. I'd love to hear a little bit more from you. We're at a design school. What are the specific design interventions you think will be most effective that we should implement as young professionals and designers for helping address these?
So it's a really good question. And what's interesting, what's so important about a design school that's at a research institution is that I think research is a very important element of this. You know, there's been a lot of guessing over the last century about placemaking and what makes environmentally good, psychologically environmentally good buildings. But in many ways, we don't know. There's some very interesting work that's being done at University of Arizona. I'm right now blanking on the name of the person who's leading that research. But there is a lot of interesting research. So number one, I'd recommend research. And then we really need to make an understanding of the effects, the cognitive effects and the social effects and the interdependent effects of place. We need to make that a larger part of the design curriculum. We've already learned a lot about, for example, the effects of access to nature. Are you familiar with all the studies about hospitals where do people familiar with these studies? So some people are nodding in the audience. There have been widely replicated studies that show that if you're in a hospital and half the rooms look at a brick wall and the other half the rooms look at a tree, those patients and patients come out of the operating room and randomly get assigned to either side, just depends on which room happens to be available, that those who look at a tree will leave as much as 3 days earlier. They use 40% less palliative drugs, etc. So the actual view of nature itself as a design element turns to be very healing, and this is now being, the science on this is strong, and so this is now being integrated into positive hospital design. So we need to learn more about these things so that we can integrate it into design. I mean, right now, for those who are familiar with this, it would be dumb to design a hospital in which the beds look at brick walls. And so the smart hospitals are not doing that. So think how much we are designing them without knowledge and how helpful that knowledge could be. Yes?
I applaud much of what you said, but you're also a developer. So suppose instead of trying to plan what people need, I merely distributed purchasing power so that every individual poor person was able to advocate for themselves. I mean, obvious example of this is that I think Section 8 housing vouchers work a lot better than public housing. I don't like tagging units as affordable, because it restricts choice. I would rather give people purchasing power. And the other thing is that you told a horror story of a large number of people, packed into a crowded dwelling. I work with a lot of poor people, and some of the most successful living structures I've seen are multi-generational immigrant families with a lot of people in the house, but an excellent social structure. And those people are really psychologically healthy. So I hope that you're not going to cast aspersions on all dense housing situations.
So this is really, actually, there are two interesting points in this. So the first one is that most of the science I described is about distribution probabilities and not causality. So I'm sure there are families who can live in very dense housing and do very well. If they're, by the way, in support of social networks, remember there are psychological aspects of a secure base. But the science shows that the probability of families who live in disruptive high dense housing, I mean, the facts are the facts. The probabilities are there's much more likely to have negative cognitive impacts. The second thing is there was another study, I think that Nick Racinos or somebody will know better than I, called the Moving to Opportunity Study. Was it a 20-year study? How long was Moving to Opportunity? 20-year study in which they studied what happens if people got Section 8 certificates and actually moved to better neighborhoods. And the results were puzzlingly the families did a little better, but they didn't do a whole lot better. And as a matter of fact, there are many ways in that their performance, their income performance sector was the same as those families that had not moved out of these poor neighborhoods. And that was, the study doesn't really explain that. And actually, I'm glad you brought that question up, because what I'm actually trying to do is describe what might be part of the explanation. Because the science about the epigenetic effects that pass on from generation to generation, the impact of these adverse childhood experiences may be part of what explains why when a family moves to a better neighborhood, they're not, in general, performing better.
I spent a good part of my career doing healthcare planning and working with mentally ill and behavioral problems. And I was intrigued recently. Are you familiar with the book called The Paradox of American Healthcare? Bradley and Taylor. And he sort of says it's very confusing to understand that though the U.S. spends something like 15, 16, 17, 19% in some cases of our gross domestic product for healthcare, our outcomes are really terrible on a whole bunch of measures. And the paradox is that even though we spend that amount of money on healthcare, we spend very little money, in fact, compared to other places that have better outcomes on housing, education, social services, and more importantly, the coordination of all that. So when you look at some of the European countries, they may only spend 9 or 10% of their gross domestic products on healthcare, but they spend much more on housing, on healthcare, on home delivered services, on coordinating them, and that's what really seems to make the difference.
Thank you. That's exactly the point I was hoping to make. And I would only change one thing, and that is that we spend 19% of our GDP on sick care, not on health care. But the point that we need to integrate these services and that the net effect to society, the net cost to society is a dramatic reduction is a very, very important point. And those who are, the Joint Center is a fantastic policy advocate, and one of my hopes is that the center will maybe make the case that there's a relationship between housing investment and larger societal mental and physical health care costs, and that it's cheaper to invest in housing. Yes, Dan.
So, Jonathan, I'm intrigued by your description of this altruistic entwinement. Is that the right term?
Yes.
I'm curious about the role of technology. We've talked about this. The role technology is changing and the ability to monitor spaces in many different ways, collect data, and analyze those data is increasing in ways that we haven't even appreciated yet. How can this technological capability be put to good use to further this altruistic tendency and the development of cities?
So every behavior, so human behavior, by the way, all systems behavior is based on feedback. And the more refined outcome of any system's behavior is dependent on more refined monitoring, sensing of conditions, analyzing it, and then figuring out solutions or responses to it. And so as we have a more pervasively infused data monitoring, big data, Internet of Things capacity to realize data, to analyze it, to understand underlying patterns, we can then begin to design shifts to it and in real time begin to get feedback. So remember, the basis of all the stuff I was talking about was this study that came out of Kaiser of this huge health database in which they observed patterns that nobody had ever put together before. So data is the beginning of our ability to do that. We then actually need out-of-the-box thinking to do, because as all of you who are scientists know, you probably don't find connections unless you're looking for them, or patterns that emerge from that. You have to set the intention to find the patterns in the data. But to me, it starts with the collection of the data, and the more we can integrate data systems, and there's a whole issue of privacy about this too, but the more that you can integrate information, the more I think we can then, if we're a society that says that it has an altruistic intention. And by the way, what I was trying to do was to say that this altruistic intention also is much better economically for society, has a much lower long-term cost. If we can align those two, then the feedback systems will help us get there.
Let me call time there. I think we could spend a lot of the evening here. Jonathan has put a lot of issues on the table, but please join me in thanking Jonathan for a very provocative.